Fellas, we're going to be going through the easiest and hardest title run, potential title run for every UFC champion right now. Starting off with the disputed heavyweight champion with Jon Jones. I think the easiest fight that Jon Jones can take next, if we're being realistic, could be Alex Pereira. And I'm saying realistic because obviously he could take on like Tatu Ivaza. But if we're talking realistically, it's Alex Pereira. Alex is a very dangerous fighter. He's one of the most dangerous fighters in the UFC, but not necessarily for grapplers. We know that he struggles with grapplers. We've seen it time and time again. He comes from a kickboxing background. We've seen him get out grappled at times against strikers in the light heavyweight division. And I know he's improved his grappling. I've got no doubt in my mind that with the work that he's been doing with Gloves to Share, he's improved it. But that doesn't matter when you're facing Jon Jones. He's been wrestling since a young age. He's been wrestling since the beginning of the UFC, since the beginning of his career, since the early days of the UFC. He's fought so many different styles, so many different wrestlers, and he's so far ahead of most heavyweight grapplers, never mind even Alex, who's far behind in general. So I think this fight, it would be a cheat code for Jon Jones. It's a big name, so it sells pay-per-views. Alex is doing well in the UFC, so there's hype behind it, unlike a guy like Stipe. And it's a very winnable fight. I think it goes very similar to the Garn fight. Jones takes him down, gets the submission over Alex Pereira, and that is why I think Alex is the easiest contender. And that's why Jones has been pushing for this fight for so long, because it's a cheat code of a matchup. He knows it's an easy fight, and Jones isn't dumb. He's not going to stand with Alex. He's going to go and shoot a takedown early on and beat Alex. And there's a few people that want to see this fight, mainly casuals who kind of want to see it because of the name value of Alex and the name value of Jones, and they might not be too familiar with Aspinall. But either way, this could happen because of the name value between the two of them and the fact that Alex is a champion and Jones is a champion, and Jones has been pushing for this fight. But either way, it is a very easy fight for Jones. He'd take him down. He's not dumb. He'd take him down and submit him within the first round. And the hardest fight, I think, for Jon Jones, and the reason I've only done one easiest is because there isn't like a long list of fighters for Jon Jones to fight next, because he's going to be realistically retired after his next fight. But the hardest one would be Tom Aspinall. And I think we all know it's Tom Aspinall. There's a reason that Jones has been trying to do everything in his power to avoid Tom Aspinall, and it's because Aspinall's a different type of heavyweight. He moves like a lightweight. He's on this knockout streak. He's got five wins in the top 10 of the heavyweight division, all by stoppage. He's also got grappling. He's a very well-rounded guy. He's not one-dimensional. He's actually the most skilled heavyweight martial artist since human beings have existed. From a skill perspective, we've never seen anybody like Tom Aspinall, and that's why in the heavyweight division, Jones only wants to nitpick fighters like Stipe Miocic, and he wants to fight the likes of Alex Pereira, and he's even called out Jamal Hill and Derek Lewis, because apparently those are fun fights, and yet somehow Tom Aspinall isn't. This would be the biggest fight in MMA because it's the most difficult fight for Jones, and people think we would see Jones get beat. And obviously Jones doesn't want to fight Aspinall for that reason. And I mean, Aspinall is the most difficult fight for a range of reasons. He's younger, he's quicker, he's more experienced in the heavyweight division, he's mentally free, he's a better boxer, he hits harder, there's less pressure for him to win. Jones is fat outside of camp. Karma's coming up to Jon Jones and catching up. So I think the hardest fight for Jon Jones, and he knows it, which is why he's trying to negotiate so much money and why this fight hasn't happened yet, is 100% without a doubt Tom Aspinall. I'd actually go and say this is one of the hardest fights of his entire career, rather than just right now. And even if he beats or loses to Aspinall, I think he's going to retire. So that's going to be the only fight in the title run that I think Jones would have, and it would be the hardest. Now, for Alex Pereira, there's going to be multiple easy fights and multiple hard fights. I think one easy fight for Alex at this moment in time would be Yuri Prochazka in a trilogy. This could still happen because Yuri obviously is coming off that really good win over Jamal Hill, and there's some people that want to see him get another title shot over Alex because they think he might have the capability to beat him. But yeah, this is an easy fight for Alex. We talked about Alex being an easy fight for Jones. Well, Yuri's an easy style for Alex as well, because I mean, we've seen Alex fight him twice. He knocked him out the first time, he knocked him out the second time, with the second one being more brutal. And this is just an easy style for Alex. We've seen this fight before. Alex completely destroyed him when it came to the leg kicks. Absolutely slashed his legs, and then eventually went up top because of Yuri's awkward style, and was able to knock out Yuri pretty comfortably in the second fight. And I think that is why I would pick Alex to beat Yuri, and why it's an easy fight, because it's an easy style for Alex. I also think the winner of Jan Blachowicz and Carlos Ulberg could be quite an easy fight when it comes to contenders in the light heavyweight division. Obviously, we've got Blachowicz and Ulberg taking each other on at UFC London in the co-main event. Jan Blachowicz is 42 years old, and he's had one win in the last, well, one fight. Yeah, he's won one fight in the last 6 years, and it was an injury win over Alexander Rakic, so he's not been doing too well. Also, obviously, Alex has beaten Jan Blachowicz before, and when it comes to Carlos Ulberg, he's massively experienced in the light heavyweight division. He's been knocked out by Kenny Dinezekuku before, which isn't a good look, and he looked very hittable against Volkanovski in his most recent fight. So I think whether it's Jan Blachowicz or whether it's Carlos Ulberg, these are two very easy options in my opinion for Alex Pereira. I know Jan Blachowicz made Alex work in the first fight, but to be fair, that was Alex's first fight in the light heavyweight division. It was in Salt Lake City, and at this point, you can only imagine that Yanni's only got worse whilst Alex has got better, and Alex still won the first fight at the end of the day. So I think the winner of Blachowicz and Ulberg, if they do give them a title shot, I think it would be the one of the easiest fights for Alex Pereira. And then I'm also going to say Dricus du Plessis moving up a weight class to face Alex could be easy. Now, I'm not saying this fight should be next or is going to be next, but Dricus has been calling out Porton. There was a few rumours after UFC 312 about a potential fight between the two of them down the line, and I think this would be quite an easy fight for Alex because, listen, Dricus du Plessis has a bad habit, and it's no surprise he likes to run in with his chin quite up in the air, and a guy like Alex, who's got such good and precise kickboxing, I think he'd counter Dricus at some point in the 25 minutes as they share the octagon and get the win over Dricus du Plessis. Again, Dricus doesn't make a fight easy for anyone, but even just the size difference as well, Dricus being at 205 with a guy like Alex, a behemoth like Alex with the precise kickboxing that he has, I think would be a terrible fight for Dricus. And then the hardest fight that I think Alex could take next is actually going to be Magomed Ankalaev, who's taking on at UFC 313. I think Ankalaev is the hardest fight for Alex Pereira in the light heavyweight division, which is why I think a lot of people are excited to see this fight. And that's because Ankalaev's dangerous everywhere. He's got decent striking. I'm not saying he's better on the feet than Alex, but he's got the striking. He knocked out Johnny Walker a couple of fights ago, and he's been predominantly striking recently, but he can also wrestle. He's one of the few light heavyweights who actually has wrestling ability. He out-wrestled Jan Blachowicz, and I know he doesn't tend to shoot takedowns that often. He's more of a striker these days, but he has got wrestling in the back pocket, which he's definitely going to show against Alex Pereira. There's no way he goes in that fight with Alex and doesn't shoot a takedown. I think he will 100% shoot a takedown, so I think Ankalaev's a really bad matchup for Alex. And I also think if Alex was to move up a weight class and face the winner of a potential fight between Jon Jones and Tom Aspinall, would be a terrible move. I don't mind Alex moving up and trying to get a third belt because if he does win, he makes history. But that's just a terribly hard matchup for Alex, whoever wins that fight, because he doesn't have that massive size that he does in the light heavyweight division. Both Tom and Jones are bigger than Alex Pereira, and they're both beasts. And I know technically the guys that Alex has been facing in the light heavyweight division are also beasts, but they ain't smart beasts like Tom Aspinall and Jon Jones, who can also grapple. Jones, like I discussed before, would take down Alex and submit him. Aspinall would rugby tackle him in his own words and get the submission early on as well. It would be a short night for Alex if he was to face either Jones or Aspinall. I don't think he'd have the same kind of one-punch power that he would have in the light heavyweight division. He'd still be extremely hard-hitting and have KO ability, but it wouldn't be as devastating as light heavyweight because of how big Aspinall and Jones are, and the grappling would be on a completely different level, and it would be way too overwhelming for Alex to deal with. And then for Dricus du Plessis, the easiest fight that I think Dricus can take on next would be Nasidim Imavov. Now, this isn't because Imavov is necessarily an easy fighter or just a bad fighter in general or anything like that, but it's just because it's nothing that Dricus hasn't seen before. Elite strikers, we saw it when Dricus faced Adesanya and submitted him, when he faced Whittaker and knocked him out, when he faced Strickland on 2 different occasions and beat him on the feet in both fights. Elite grapplers, he beat Derek Brunson a couple of years ago, and Chimaev's the elite grappler of the division. So there's nothing that Imavov has that no other fighter that Dricus has fought doesn't have, you know what I mean? Like, he is a really good striker, is Imavov, and he does seem to be getting better as each fight goes on, but it's not like a completely new and awkward style for Dricus to deal with. I also think Belal Muhammad potentially moving up a weight class to face Dricus could be easy. Again, I'm not saying this is going to be next, but Belal Muhammad has been talking about potentially becoming double champ, and he's got a bit of back and forth going on with Dricus du Plessis, and this would just be an easy fight for Dricus in my opinion. Because Dricus on the feet, even though Belal didn't look too bad against Leon, Dricus is much better on the feet against Belal Muhammad. He just outstruck what's meant to be a decent striker in Sean Strickland for 25 minutes straight at UFC 312. And with the grappling, he's got wrestling, just Dricus du Plessis. He's very, very strong for the middleweight division, and he's out-wrestled a lot of his opponents recently in his title run. And Belal Muhammad's a small welterweight, and Dricus is quite a big middleweight as well. So I don't think Belal Muhammad would have the same wrestling and the strength advantage that he does in the welterweight division. I think this would be a fight that takes place mainly on the feet, where Dricus just picks apart Belal Muhammad for 25 minutes. So I think Belal would be quite an easy stylistic matchup for Dricus. Now, the hardest fight for Dricus du Plessis would it be Khamzat Chimaev, which hopefully is going to be the next fight we see in the middleweight division for the belt, which is why it's so exciting. Now, we have seen Dricus struggle with grappling before. He struggled against Dricus du Plessis and against Derek Brunson with the wrestling at times. Now, obviously, he made a comeback, but he still struggled. And Chimaev's the scariest grappler in the UFC. Whether you go back to his early days in the UFC on his kind of come up on the UFC to his Kevin Holland fight, to him out wrestling a good wrestler in Usman in the first round of their fight at UFC 294, to him recently just dominating and mauling Robert Whittaker, looking scarier than ever in the middleweight division. Chimaev is an extremely scary matchup for anybody in the division, Dricus du Plessis included. Even though this is still a 50-50 matchup because we've only seen a bit of octagon time in the middleweight division with Chimaev, because of how good his wrestling has looked and how scary his submission game has looked, it's automatically a difficult fight for Dricus du Plessis. I also think a theoretical fight between the winner of Imavov and Barallo would be tough. Now, I just went on about how Imavov would be quite an easy matchup, but that's as of right now. If you can go out there and beat Caio Barallo, without a doubt, Imavov would be the top contender of the division and would therefore, in my opinion, have done enough to show himself as a hard contender. I mean, this should be next, in my opinion, Imavov and Barallo. We've also got Chimaev fighting for the belt next, but after that, they're both like a fight away from a title shot. I mean, if Imavov does beat Barallo, he would have beaten Barallo, and he would have probably won that via striking, and he would also have beaten Adesanya, Cannonier, and Roman Dolidze on top of that, which is a pretty good resume in the middleweight division. And if, you know, he's got KO ability too. He just knocked out Adesanya, so could he maybe capitalize on the style of Dricus? And if Caio Barallo wins, I mean, he would have beaten Imavov and Jared Cannonier in the middleweight division. Again, probably from striking. He's got decent and powerful striking, does Caio Barallo, and he's also got wrestling, does Caio Barallo, that a lot of people don't really tend to see. He showed it against Abbas Magomedov, so he's a more well-rounded guy. But either way, I think if they do a matchup between Caio Barallo and Imavov, the winner of that fight would be a really tough fight for Dricus du Plessis, just because of the striking that they both possess. And I also think, like I said before, Dricus moving up a weight class to take on Alex would be tough. As defensively sound Dricus has kind of been forcing himself to become a lot lately, I still think at some point in the fight, when you're facing a kickboxer like Alex Pereira, he'd just find a way to clip Dricus with the size advantage and he would knock him out. And I know Dricus has the ability to take the fight to the mat with the wrestling, but even then, Alex, we've seen him in bad wrestling positions before, and it's not like Dricus is the same level as like a Jon Jones or a Tom Aspinall. He's a smaller guy, and I think Alex's work with Glover Teixeira would have paid off against a guy like Dricus du Plessis rather than maybe like an Ankalaev or a Jones or an Aspinall. So I would say that a tough matchup would be Alex Pereira for Dricus du Plessis. And then for Belal Muhammad, I think an easy fight for Belal Muhammad. Now, I really hope this isn't the case, but I think Jack Della Maddalena is quite an easy fight for Belal Muhammad. They're obviously going to be fighting at UFC 315 at Canada, which was recently announced. And I think JDM's quite an easy stylistic fight for Belal Muhammad. If you look at JDM's past couple of fights, he beat Gilbert Burns, but he lost 2.5 rounds against Gilbert Burns, where he was losing because of the wrestling. Gilbert Burns was out wrestling JDM. He was taking him down, putting him in bad positions, and that was predominantly why he lost to Gilbert Burns. Before that, he went to a split decision against Kevin Holland. Now, even though he did look really good and crisp in the fight with the striking, going to a split decision with Kevin Holland and 2 fights later fighting Belal Muhammad is never a good look. Before that, he arguably loses to Basil Hafez. Now, I know that was on short notice and he had to deal with weight cuts, but Basil Hafez is 1-2 in the UFC, and he's just been knocked out by Auburn Elliott, and you nearly lost to that guy. And before that, he was finishing a bunch of guys, but they were all unranked anyway. But based off what I saw in that Gilbert Burns fight and the lack of top contenders that JDM has fought in the welterweight division, I've got to assume that Belal Muhammad wins that fight via dominant wrestling, just taking down JDM and controlling him. So I think JDM's quite an easy stylistic matchup for Belal. I also think if they give the winner of Sean Brady and Leon Edwards a title shot, that would also be a very easy fight for Belal Muhammad and a very easy title run for him to go on. We've obviously got Leon Edwards and Sean Brady taking each other on at UFC London, which was recently announced as a replacement fight to Leon versus JDM. If it ends up being Belal versus Leon Part 2, the first fight was dominant in favor of Belal Muhammad. He was picking up Leon Edwards, dunking him, completely dominating him with the wrestling for pretty much 24 minutes. It wasn't a competitive fight at all. I mean, if it's Sean Brady, I mean, if you're getting finished on the feet by Belal Muhammad, there's no way in hell I'm picking to beat Belal Muhammad a second time. So the winner of Leon Edwards and Sean Brady, if they were to give them a title shot against Belal Muhammad, it would be an easy fight for Belal Muhammad. Probably the easiest in the entire division, based off what I've seen in the first fight between the two of them. Now, the hardest fight for Belal Muhammad, in my opinion, would be Joaquin Buckley. I think Buckley's a terrible stylistic matchup for Belal Muhammad. First of all, he's a great wrestler, both offensively and defensively. Obviously, comes from more of a wrestling background in the middleweight division, and he's got good defensive wrestling. He's a very dangerous stand-up guy. Dropped Colby Covington, was piecing him up and knocked out Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Very hard-hitting guy. He's strong for the welterweight division too. He's a former middleweight coming down to the welterweight division, and the guy's just super strong for the division. And he's got good stamina. People assume that he's got bad stamina because of this muscular physique. Buckley's actually got really good stamina for the muscle mass that he does have, so I think he ticks a lot of boxes, and he would be a terrible fight. Look at his past couple of fights. TKO against Covington, knockout over Wonderboy. TKO against Luque, dominant decision over Ruzi Boyev, who's huge for the welterweight division anyway. So I think Joaquin Buckley's the worst matchup for Belal Muhammad in the division, and would be a terrible title run, well, terrible fight for him in terms of an easy title run. I also think, obviously, Shavkat Rakhmonov, you can't talk about difficult fights and not include Shavkat. I know people are calling him overrated based on his fight with Ian Garry, but at the end of the day, the guy's 19-0 with 18 finishes on his name. He's beat Ian Garry, he's beat Jeff Neal, he beat Neil Magny, he beat Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. He's got decent wrestling, does Shavkat. He's got a wrestling game that he displayed in the fight with Stephen Thompson and Ian Garry. He's also got amazing submission game, definitely got better submission game than Belal Muhammad, so if anybody's going to get a submission, it's going to be Shavkat. And the striking of Shavkat is also elite. I'd say he's a better striker than Belal Muhammad as well, so he ticks a lot of boxes, and he's arguably better, well, a lot more well-rounded, I guess, than Belal Muhammad. The only place where I'd give Belal Muhammad the advantage is with the pure wrestling, but another really tough fight for Belal Muhammad. And then for Islam Makhachev, an easy fight for Islam Makhachev at 155, I think would be Justin Gaethje. I was originally going to say Justin Gaethje versus Dan Hooker winner, but obviously now that fight's been cancelled. Assuming that Gaethje would have beaten Hooker, I think this would have been an easy fight that the UFC could have put on to give Gaethje a title shot, and it would have been quite disappointing because a lot of Makhachev's recent fights have been lackluster opponents, and Gaethje, unfortunately, would have been one of them. I think it would just be part 2 of Makhachev versus Poirier, where it's a fairly competitive stand-up fight where they both kind of have moments on the feet where eventually Makhachev takes him down and submits Justin Gaethje, which would happen. We've seen Gaethje in 2 title fights before. He got submitted in both of them. Now, fair enough, they were against the best grapplers at the time with Khabib and Oliveira, but Makhachev's also an elite grappler, and I think actually Poirier is probably a tougher fight than Justin Gaethje because of how stylistically, difficult, but stylistically technical, I guess, Dustin Poirier is in comparison to Justin Gaethje. And the hardest fight for Islam Makhachev to take next, for his next fight in the title run, would be Ilia Topuria. This fight has been getting heavily rumoured recently with Topuria moving up to the 155 division, and it's because Topuria has no known weaknesses just in MMA in general. I mean, he's got great stamina, which he showed in that fight with Josh Emmett. He's got wrestling. He's got submissions. He comes from a grappling background, which a lot of people seem to forget about. He's got good boxing, arguably the best boxer in the UFC. He's got KO power, which he displayed in his last 2 fights. He just knocked out and cracked the chin of Max Holloway. Before that, he was the first guy to knock out Alexander Volkanovski in the featherweight division. He's a terrible matchup for Islam Makhachev because of how well-rounded he is, how tough he is. And I mean, Dustin Poirier went 5 rounds and put the work in against Islam Makhachev. If you're performing like that against Poirier, now obviously we don't know how Topuria is going to look against the top contenders in the lightweight division, but you can only assume that Topuria is going to be a nightmare matchup for Makhachev based off what we saw when he faced Volkanovski as well. I would still favour Makhachev 60-40%, but I'd still think this is a terrible matchup for Makhachev and not one that I even recommend betting on. I also think a winner between a potential fight between Charles Oliveira and Arman Tsarukyan would also be a really difficult fight for Islam Makhachev. I think this fight makes sense between Oliveira and Tsarukyan, considering they're both a fight away from a title shot. If Arman Tsarukyan wins, he would have beaten Oliveira 2 times in a row, and he would without a doubt be the #1 contender. And if Oliveira wins, it'd be on a winning streak against Chandler, against Arman Tsarukyan, and he would 100% be the #1 contender. So I think that fight makes sense. And it's a difficult fight. The winner would be a difficult fight for Islam Makhachev. Oliveira is a dangerous fighter. I know he got dominated by Makhachev before, but he's still very dangerous. He showed that he's got good wrestling in his recent fight against Michael Chandler, which we've never really seen Oliveira display before. He's got KO power on the feet with good striking, and I assume he'd be a lot smarter this time around against Islam Makhachev. And for Tsarukyan, he's arguably got equal wrestling to Islam Makhachev based off what we saw in the first fight, and he's also got the striking too. He's also got really good striking, which he showed against Oliveira and specifically Beneil Dariush. So if they do book a fight between Oliveira and Tsarukyan, the winner of that fight would be a terrible opponent for, it wouldn't be terrible, but would be a hard opponent for Islam Makhachev to take on for his next fight in the lightweight division. Now, for Alexander Volkanovski, I know he's not officially the champion, but he's going to be fighting for the belt, and considering he is a former champion, and I think he beats Lopez, I'm going to say that Volkanovski is the champion. Now, the easiest fight for Volkanovski for his first title run back in the featherweight division would be Movsar Evloev. If he was to face Movsar Evloev for the belt instead of Lopez, this would be the easiest case for Alexander Volkanovski because he's been knocked out by Islam Makhachev and knocked out by Topuria in his last 2. There's no KO threat when you're facing Movsar Evloev. He's had nothing but decisions in his UFC career. He's only had 3 KOs/TKOs in his entire MMA career as a whole. There's no finishing threat from Movsar Evloev, so I think Volkanovski is safe in that aspect, and therefore it's an easy fight. And from a wrestling perspective, he's had to deal with Makhachev in the lightweight division, where he looked really good defending the takedowns and stopping the grappling of Makhachev in their first fight. And on top of that, he'd completely piece up Movsar Evloev in the stand-up department. I mean, Evloev arguably lost to Arnold Allen, never mind Volkanovski. So I think Volkanovski the easiest fight at the top of the featherweight division would be Movsar. I also think the winner of Yair Rodriguez and Patricio Pitbull would be an easy fight for Volk. That fight's obviously booked for UFC 314 on the same card as Volkanovski versus Lopez. And if they were to give the winner of that fight a title shot, it's just another easy fight for Volkanovski. I mean, when it comes to Yair Rodriguez, we've seen this fight before. Volkanovski was picking him apart on the feet for the majority of the fight, clipped him on the feet, just was doing better with the striking, then eventually took him down effortlessly and finished Yair Rodriguez in the third round. And then if it's Patricio Pitbull got knocked out like 2 fights ago, and he also lost to Sergio Pettis, who's nowhere near on the same level as Alexander Volkanovski. He's washed, is Pitbull. So I think Volkanovski, regardless of who he faces, would win that fight between Yair Rodriguez and Patricio Pitbull, and would therefore be another easy fight for Volkanovski in his title run. Now, the hardest fight I think next for Volkanovski would have been had Topuria stayed in the featherweight division. If Topuria wouldn't have gone to the lightweight division and would have stayed at featherweight, this would have been the worst case scenario for Alexander Volkanovski, because you've got no reason to pick Volkanovski over Topuria. Again, we've seen the first fight. Topuria knocked out Alexander Volkanovski early. He displayed good boxing, got him against the cage and just knocked him out. And since their last fight, Volkanovski's been sat on the couch. He's hit 36 years old, whereas Topuria's had a full training camp and has knocked out Max Holloway and he's been active since their fight. I assume if this fight was to be booked again, Topuria would knock him out again and he'd beat Alexander Volkanovski. You've got no reason to pick Volkanovski to beat him in a rematch, and therefore I think Topuria would 100% be the worst matchup for Volkanovski. And I guess the performance that he had against him the first time kind of shows that. And I think the second worst matchup would be Diego Lopez, the guy who's going to be taking on at UFC 314. I think this is a terrible fight. Not a terrible fight, but I think this is quite a bad matchup for Alexander Volkanovski. I'd say it's 50-50, but I still think this is a difficult fight for Volkanovski to come back to, because Lopez is the young, hungry guy who has KO ability. He hits very hard. He displayed that against Sadiq Youssef. He displayed it in his most recent fight when he dropped Brian Ortega in like 30 seconds. He's also got jiu-jitsu. He's also got really good submissions where he's dangerous with the ground game too. So there's just nowhere in the fight where Volkanovski's safe. On the feet, he's got to deal with the KO power from Lopez. In the grappling, he's got to deal with the submission game of Diego Lopez. So Volkanovski's got to be very careful in this fight with Diego Lopez. Like, you look at the rest of the featherweight contenders, Ortega and Rodriguez are Volk victims. Evloev has no danger. Diego Lopez is dangerous everywhere the fight goes. So when it comes to Lopez versus Volkanovski, even though I would still probably lean towards Volkanovski winning this fight against Diego Lopez, it's still a very difficult matchup. And then for Merab Dvalishvili, the Bantamweight champion, the easiest fight for Merab next would be Pete Yan. And he can make a case to say that he wants Yan next. Yan's on a 2-fight winning streak over Figueiredo and Song Yadong. And he's the only top contender in the Bantamweight division who's coming on a winning streak. And we've seen this fight before. Merab faced Pete Yan before, and it was probably Merab's most dominating performance. He absolutely dominated Pete Yan in this fight. I think he set a record with the amount of takedowns he shot. He was just shooting takedown after takedown over Pete Yan, and Pete Yan could do nothing to stop it. It was pure domination from Pete Yan, 50-45 against Pete Yan, and absolutely dominated him. And therefore, if they were to rematch, I've got no reason to pick Pete Yan over Merab. I've got no doubt in my mind that Pete Yan's improved. I've got no doubt in my mind that Merab's improved. I think the same would go again. Merab would take down Pete Yan round after round, dominate him with the wrestling, and beat Pete Yan a second time around. I also think Sean O'Malley, at this point in time, would be an easy fight. Now, this has been heavily rumoured for UFC. I don't know what card it's been rumoured for, but this has also been a fight that's been rumoured recently, even though O'Malley doesn't deserve a rematch. And I also think the reason we don't want to see a rematch is because O'Malley's done nothing to show that he would make it any more competitive in the second fight. We've seen this fight before. Similar to the Pete Yan fight, even though it wasn't as dominant, Merab was still able to pretty much take down Sean O'Malley most times when he wanted to, controlling with the wrestling shoot, takedown after takedown, keep that heavy output pace, and beat Sean O'Malley. Now, even though O'Malley has got the KO threat because he's a very long, dangerous striker, in the first fight, O'Malley didn't hurt him once in the entire 25 minutes. Maybe the body kick in the 5th round, but apart from that, didn't really hurt him once, and Merab won 4 of the 5 rounds that they had, or maybe even 5, so I think Sean O'Malley would be quite an easy fight for Merab. I also think Pantoja moving up from the flyweight division to take on Merab would be quite an easy fight for Merab as well. Now, this is a fight that I do think should happen next. I think it makes a lot of sense based off the divisions, and it's a champ versus champ matchup that I would heavily favour Merab in this fight, because Merab's a dominant wrestler in the bantamweight division, and Pantoja's a scrappy midget who relies on people gassing out. What Pantoja does well is using his scrappy striking style to overwhelm people in the stand-up so we can eventually take people down and put people in bad positions. Merab ain't going to let that happen. Umar Nurmagomedov tried against Merab and he failed. I think Merab would dominate Pantoja in the grappling exchanges, out-wrestle him, take him down, avoid any danger from the submission of Pantoja. I mean, Pantoja got taken down by Steve Erceg and Brandon Moreno at times in their fight. I think in this fight, Merab would definitely have the advantage. Now, I think the hardest fight for Merab in the bantamweight division would actually be a rematch with Umar Nurmagomedov. I think stylistically, still in this division, Nurmagomedov was a terrible fight for Merab. Now, obviously, we saw this fight a couple of months ago. Merab beat Umar Nurmagomedov, but it was a close fight. And if you think about it, Merab's had 13 UFC fights. Umar's had 7. So he's fairly inexperienced in the UFC's Umar. I think if we give Umar a couple more ranked fighters, a couple more guys in the top 10 to get that experience at the highest level, he could come back and make it a competitive fight against Merab in a potential rematch. And because of how stylistically challenging he is, I think that'll be a difficult fight for Merab. I also think the winner of potentially a fight with Sandhagen and Davison Figueiredo could be a bad fight for Merab, because Sandhagen and Figueiredo are two very well-rounded guys. Both of those guys taking each other on, I think would be a tricky fight for Merab in the division as well. So I think those would be the most difficult fights for Merab. And then finally for the flyweight champion Pantoja, I think the easiest fight that Pantoja could take on next would be Brandon Royval. Again, he can make a case to say that he wants Royval next. Royval's on a 2-fight win streak over Moreno and Tatsuro Taira. So if Pantoja wanted to, he could make a case to say that he wants the #1 ranked Royval. But again, we've seen this fight before, and it wasn't even competitive. We saw it just over a year ago, where Pantoja dominated Royval, took him down round after round. He did kind of fade as the fight went on, but still the majority of the fight was in favour of Pantoja, both with the striking and the grappling, and he looked really good in that fight. So I had no reason to pick Royval over Pantoja again. I also think Brandon Moreno would be an easy fight at this stage for Pantoja. Now, I know people like to go on about how Moreno's like a stylistically difficult fight for Pantoja, but he's lost to him 3 times. If he's so stylistically difficult, how have you lost to Pantoja on 3 different occasions? Now, I have no doubt in my mind, just like the third fight, it would be a back-and-forth fight. It would be a difficult fight for Pantoja. He'd have to go out there and have an absolute dogfight, but I would definitely think that this could be a winnable fight for Pantoja because of how scrappy he makes it, and the fact that he's won this fight on 3 different occasions. I just can't help but think that Moreno at this stage is still quite an easy fight for Pantoja. I mean, you've got to remember, 2 fights ago, Moreno lost to Royval. Fair enough, he might have been controversial, but he still lost. Now, the hardest fight for Pantoja, I think, at this moment in time would be Kai Kara France. There's been rumours of this fight taking place at UFC 314, and now apparently it's going to be taking place at UFC 316. This is quite a bad matchup for Pantoja in the flyweight division, because Kai Kara France is a powerful striker with elite takedown defense. He trains at City Kickboxing. He's got good takedown defense. He's shown it in multiple fights before, so I think he keeps the fight standing. And he's got genuine KO ability. He hits like a truck in the flyweight division to Kai Kara France. Pantoja, you look at the fight with Erceg, he went 5 rounds of war with Steve Erceg, arguably lost. Kai Kara France didn't even make it past the first. He straight up knocked out Steve Erceg early on. So I think if Steve Erceg can keep the fight standing and kind of capitalise on that scrappy style of Pantoja, he could make this really bad. And I've also gone with Merab, like I said before. Merab's a big bantamweight. I think he'd out-wrestle Pantoja, kind of nullify the scrappy style of Pantoja and get the win by decision. But that is, in my opinion, the easiest and hardest title run for every UFC champion in the UFC. Their potential fights that they could take on next that are ranked by difficulty. Let me know if you agree with these matchups and if you change or switch any matchups around. But thank you for watching.